Is Dr. and former Governor of the state of Oregon, John Kitzhaber. He graduated from high school in Eugene and then went to undergraduate school at Dartmouth and medical school at the Oregon Health Sciences University here in Portland. After graduating, he practiced emergency medicine in Southern Oregon, I believe in Grants Pass, for a number of years before he was elected to the Oregon legislature and then elected governor of our fine state. Since his career as governor, he now works in health and medical education. He is director of education at the Foundation for Medical Excellence, which is part of the Oregon Wellness Program. Part of what they do is provide mental health resources to our stressed out medical professionals. So please help me welcome Governor Kitzhaber.
It's going to be hard to compete with Mickey Rooney. I really appreciate the chance to, I think I'll pull this thing out of here, join you today. I have had the opportunity to speak to Rotary clubs across Oregon and across the Northwest for a number of years, and I almost always accept the invitations because of three things that I've come to associate with Rotary clubs. One is enhancing community, one's improving lives, and one is advancing goodwill and peace. And I think if there's anything we need a little bit more of right now, it's community and goodwill and peace. I was asked about a week ago, 10 days ago, to give you a title for my talk, and I was still working on it. So I picked one out and I called it Building Community from Conflict. And I think that is one of our central challenges that we face today, not just in Oregon, but across our country. And my central thesis is that community is the product of a common mission, of some sense of common purpose, something that's larger than ourselves, something that we all want to invest in, maybe even sacrifice for. And I think that finding or rediscovering our sense of common purpose here in our state might be the antidote to some of the unraveling of the fabric of our society that we've been witnessing for the last couple of years. So what I'd like to try to do today is just give you a quick overview of sort of where we are as we approach this 2022 election cycle, and then offer a possible path that could move us beyond the division and polarization that I think is undermining our ability to get things done here in Oregon. And I'm going to share a big idea with you, admittedly a big idea, but I think we face really big challenges, and I just don't think we're going to get from here to there with small ball thinking. Excuse me. I don't watch much television, but when I do, it's almost impossible to escape this barrage of campaign ads that's going on right now. And they're very troubling to me. They're very dark. They're very vitriolic. They're very divisive. And they remind me of something that David Frohnmeyer said, and I have it on my phone here because I forgot it when I left my house today. David Frohnmeyer said to the City Club in Eugene in 1994, and I think it's very poignant. I hear an ancient noise rising in Oregon. To my ears, it's a raucous, ragged sound. I hear it when I watch parts of the local TV news, when I read about some of the new initiative petitions in the newspaper, when I open a piece of junk mail urging me to contribute to an anti-something campaign. It sounds like 100 drummers and different drums, each beating their own rhythm. It sounds like a cacophony of 100 tribes, each speaking their own tongue. It sounds like 100 calls to battle. It is the growth of a politics based on narrow concerns, rooted in the exploitation of divisions of class, caste, gender, region, religion, ethnicity, morality, and ideology. A give no quarter and take no prisoners activism that demands satisfaction and accepts no compromise. If you recall, David, who was a very close personal friend of mine, was a former legislator, was our attorney general, was a Republican nominee for governor in 1990, was the 15th president of the University of Oregon. He was a great loss. He called this the new tribalism. And he said that it was factionalizing our politics and tearing apart our common mission and our potential for a hopeful future. If you think about it, David made those remarks just 4 years after the World Wide Web was established, and at about exactly the same time that the internet was being commercialized. And he made those remarks 10 years before Facebook and Twitter and all sorts of other anonymous social media allowed people to attack and demonize one another without ever meeting them, without ever giving the benefit of the doubt, without ever actually talking to them. Truly, in my mind, the ultimate manifestation of the new tribalism. So does any of that ring true when you look out across Oregon or across the country today? Are we, as David said, tearing apart our potential for a hopeful future? Is that where we are? You know, my answer is not yet. But I also think that unless there is some leadership from communities and folks like yourselves, both in the public and private sector, that is surely where we are headed. As I mentioned, I think that a hopeful and brightful future is the product of a common mission, product of a sense of common purpose, because without a common purpose, there can't be any community. And it's a lack of community that makes us vulnerable to the kind of tribalism that David talked about 30 years ago. So what is it that could bring us back together as a group of people who live in Oregon who definitely have different views and different aspects? I think part of the problem is that we tend to view our social and economic and political challenges as disconnected silos, as mutually exclusive values, when in fact, many of them are very, very interrelated, and it's almost impossible to solve them in isolation from one another. And the result is that our politics have become balkanized. We have education advocates, transportation, healthcare, economic development, forest management, etc. And that creates a zero-sum politics of scarcity that always creates a winner and a loser, and I think contributes to the polarization, and it undermines our ability to actually come together and take action, collective action as a society to move us all forward. However, I think if we were able to show, this is the big idea, the beginning of the big idea, the runway to the big idea. If we were actually able to show that these disparate areas are actually interconnected, that they actually lead to some larger common goals, so we might be able to broaden the constituency base, engage people who don't think they have anything in common in a larger purpose. And I think that could grow the solution space and create a place for us to come back together and reclaim some sense of common identity and shared purpose here as Oregonians. So I'm going to illustrate that with two sort of high profile areas that don't seem to be connected. One of them is houselessness or homelessness, and one of them is wildfire. Most people don't think those have too much to do with one another. So let me start with the homeless problem. As you know, that's a growing issue around the state. It poses a very serious policy challenge for a number of reasons. It's very viscerally visible, which makes it almost impossible to avoid, to ignore in a political sense. Also, the availability of affordable housing is essential to a wide range of other things that are critical to the stability of our society. If you think about it, housing is at the bottom tier of Maslow's hierarchy. It's a basic need, and it impacts all sorts of other things. And although the political debate, particularly here in Portland, is being driven by street homelessness, homelessness, in my view, is actually a symptom of several much larger system failures. And the one I want to talk to you about today is a serious underproduction of housing that we face here in Oregon, with the full recognition that housing is impacted by our battered and fractured behavioral health system. It's also impacted by the lack of any systemic way to connect housing insecure people who are leaving the hospital or being released from incarceration, or kids who are aging out of foster care with affordable housing. Right now, they're essentially discharged to street. But what I want to talk to you about tonight is the housing shortage. Over the next 20 years, Oregon faces a projected need of 580,000 housing units. And only 5% of those are needed to house people who are currently homeless. The rest of them are underproduction and projected need. What's that's done, this shortage has profoundly changed the supply-demand equation and driven up housing prices. You've probably noticed that. And as housing prices go up, more people have to rent. And if more people have to rent, it reduces the availability of renting units and drives up rental prices. So today, a third of Oregonians, 30% of Oregonians are spending a third of their income on housing. And even before the pandemic, we had 156,000 people who were paying 50% of their income for housing. They're just on the cusp of becoming homeless. And the result is this dramatic increase in chronic housing insecurity that we're seeing all over the state of Oregon. And I think without an aggressive and comprehensive strategy to significantly increase the rate of housing production, we're going to fall further and further behind. That's going to undermine our economy and our workforce, and I think the health of our communities. And without some kind of comprehensive strategy to increase housing supply across the state, it's going to be difficult here in Portland to move beyond the paralysis that we've seen for the last couple of years, which is between people who basically want short-term temporary housing to get people off the streets and people who want long-term supportive housing. And it's a false choice because both of them are necessary, but neither one of them increases the housing supply, which is really the root cause that we're trying to address. I think it's also important to know that chronic housing insecurity is not just a housing issue. It's a major driver of family instability. And family instability, it drives something, a well-documented group of experiences called adverse childhood experiences. That it involves a parent who has a mental health issue, or a substance abuse issue, domestic violence, a family that's broken up by divorce or incarceration or abandonment. And those ACEs lead to really poor physical and mental and behavioral outcomes later in life and trigger this generational cycle of poverty that's growing across our state. So resolving this crisis, I think, means moving the political debate from just dealing with the very visible homeless problem to the larger issue of how do we increase housing supply across the state of Oregon, without which we can't address the homeless problem. So I think that even, given the magnitude of this housing crisis that's bearing down on us, time is not our friend here. If we hope to ramp up housing production fast enough and high enough to avoid the consequences of this tsunami that's about to land on our beach, then we need a big, bold idea, one that can actually cut through the paralysis that is surrounding the housing issue and bring us together. And that brings me to this seemingly unrelated issue of wildfires. So wildfire is also a really highly visible issue. It's really hard to ignore. There was a moment last month when Seattle had the worst air quality on the planet. We had that same distinction here a couple of years ago. So you can't really hide from wildfires and from the smoke. Wildfire also contributes to homelessness. There are still people living up the McKenzie and Santiam River Canyons and in the Talent Phoenix area down in Oregon who are still living in temporary housing from the Labor Day fire that occurred in 2020. So the increased frequency and intensity of wildfires across the West is not just, it's due in part to climate change, but it's also due to past forest practices that have left 5.6 million acres of landscape in Oregon at a very, very high risk of wildfire. And the ability to manage our forested landscape in a way that makes sense from an economic and environmental and social standpoint is constrained by this landscape it's this patchwork of ownership patterns and business models and management protocols. And that limits our ability to manage our forests to solutions that fit into this crazy artificially constructed landscape. So I'll just give you an example. We have about 30 million acres of forest in Oregon. 64% are owned and managed by the public, mostly by the federal government, but also by the state and local government. Those acres have 3 different agencies managing them under 3 completely different management protocols. So there's this one set of trees that's managed by the U.S. Forest Service. They report to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they have one management plan. Then we have some trees over here that look pretty much like this other set of trees. They're managed by the Bureau of Land Management that sits in the Department of the Interior and has a different management protocol. And then we got some more trees over here that are managed by the state of Oregon, and they're managed by the Department of Forestry under yet another management protocol. It's almost impossible to develop holistic policies across that fragmented landscape. So suppose we were to try to figure out how to marry addressing the housing supply problem with reducing wildfire risk. What would that look like? It would require 2 things. The first thing it would require would be to begin to view our forested landscape as a whole and try to imagine and harmonize management practices that would deliver shared outcomes across the entire landscape rather than just little pieces of it. By managing across the entire landscape, it gives you the ability to look across 30 million acres and figure out how you want to best balance environmental needs and economic needs and community needs, and also to ensure that your management practices are improving the health of the forest and reducing wildfire risk over time. The other side of the handshake requires that Oregon, and in partnership with the federal government and the private sector, to make a high priority on building 20,000, I'm just picking this number, but it's probably in the ballpark, 20,000 new housing units every year for 20 years by creating a market for low value wood. And let me elaborate on that. There's 5.6 million acres that are at very high risk of catching fire, need to be treated. And those treatments involve removing smaller trees, reducing fuel load, and it produces what we call restoration fiber, but it's the small, not very valuable fiber that comes off the landscape when you improve the health of that landscape, right? There's no market for that. There's also no market for slash, which is the tops and limbs and the other debris that are left over after commercial forestry operation. So if Oregon were to create a market for low value wood by making this commitment to build 20,000 units a year, and then use that wood to supply Oregon mass timber companies and Oregon modular housing companies, it would have the same impact as a long-term forest stewardship contract or a timber supply contract. That is, it creates the economic certainty over 2 decades for private sector businesses to invest in expanding mill capacity in certain parts of the state, Roseburg, for example, or on the east side, to build out the infrastructure for mass timber, build out the infrastructure for modular housing, expand workforce training in the forest products industry and in the building trades, and use those resources as a lever to ensure that we're diversifying the workforce as we go and we're actually paying people a living wage job. So now, if you think about it, we're solving not just for wildfire, we're not solving just for reducing wildfire and improving forest health, we're also solving for workforce housing. We're solving for homelessness. We're solving for increasing family stability. We're solving for reducing the generational cycle of adverse childhood experiences. So think of the constituencies that are now working together. You've got people in Douglas County or in Medford who are concerned about rural economic development and losing their homes to a wildfire, working with people in downtown Portland who are concerned about reducing homelessness and improving long-term supportive housing and improving family stability. What I actually outlined the key elements of this in a presentation of the Oregon Board of Forestry last April. And it is a big idea, but it just seems to me that what we're doing isn't working. When you have a need for 580,000 units and you're nibbling around the edges and all working in silos, it's just not going to get us where we need to go. The approach we're taking right now is fragmented, it's siloed, and most importantly, it's built around conflict rather than around collaboration and around community. So in short, I think the housing supply problem, not just the homeless problem, but the larger housing supply problem is an existential threat to the economic and social fabric of our state. It has huge implications for our economy and for our workforce, not to mention its impact on child welfare and our ability to effectively treat substance abuse disorders and behavioral health problems. It's a statewide emergency, and I think it deserves a statewide response that aggressively accelerates the production of housing in our state. At the same time, I think it also provides a huge opportunity to break through this current siloed approach to policymaking and figuring how we can come together, multiple groups that may not think they have anything in common, to address something that is actually impacting all of us in one way or another. Let me just wrap this up by taking you back to 1979, which was my first term in the Oregon legislature. And during that session, almost every evening, we all went down, Republicans and Democrats, the lobby, members of the press, we all went down to this downtown Salem watering hole called the Hindquarter. I think the Black Angus sits on it now, or maybe the Salem Convention Center. And we would gather there together. We would discuss what went on that day. We'd enjoy each other's company, and we would get to know each other as people beyond the politics and the partisan label. And some of you may remember this, but at the head of the table almost always was with his carafe of rosé close at hand was this prolific reporter from the Eugene Register-Guard named Henny Willis. You probably recognize many of the names of people who showed up around that table in 1979. David Frohnmeyer, Bill Rutherford, Ted Kulingoski, Norma Paulus, Vera Katz, Frank Roberts, L.B. Day. You know, it was an era where civility actually prevailed in Oregon politics. We fought with each other during the election cycle. We didn't take any of it personally, and quite frankly, it wasn't nearly as personal and mean-spirited as it is today. And then we'd leave all that behind us once the legislature started. In the spring, we actually had pickup softball games with Republicans and Democrats, with the lobby, reporters, and a couple of members of the Oregonian editorial board. It was an era where we were Oregonians first and partisans second. It was an era where we fought about a lot of things, but we didn't fight about the big things. We didn't fight about education or transportation or public safety. It was a time when your handshake was your bond, when if you're going to vote against someone's bill, you'd walk across the floor and tell them that you're going to do it, where we'd debate each other passionately during the day and raise a glass to each other in the evening. And, you know, sadly, somehow we've lost that. Somehow we've let that slip away, that adhesiveness, that stability, that sense of camaraderie. And I think we're poor for the loss. And I think we're seeing that loss across the landscape in politics here in Oregon. And I'm sharing that with you simply to remind you of what we're capable of. You know, we can't turn back the clock, but we can make a different set of choices going forward. Civility is actually a choice, and partisanship is a choice. You know, during the many years I practiced in the ER down in Roseburg, I can't remember a single instance where I checked someone's party registration before I brought them in to look at them. I don't think I ever noticed whether Republicans believe different than Democrats, or whether cardiovascular disease or cancer respects, you know, political ideology and partisan labels. It just seems to me that in this divided country of ours, in this divided state, we should never forget that we have a choice. We have a choice, I think, about what we want our state to be in the future. We have a choice about who we want to be as Oregonians and as fellow human beings. And to me, it's a choice to put understanding before reaction, and to put collaboration before conflict, and to put reconciliation before recrimination. And I'm hoping that reconciliation begins on November 9th in our state. And I think reconciliation begins with each individual, in the heart of each person, animated by a choice and by a desire to make our state a better place, and to try to rebuild the tattered fabric of this wonderful, wonderful place we call Oregon. Thank you very much.
Seems like the outside that street civility at the other side of the party doesn't. Can you address why you bring civility back? One person in that.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I believe that politics is not unlike anything else in life. It's about relationships. And what's happened, I think, is that we have lost a space outside the Capitol where people can actually get together and know each other. It's certainly happened in spades in, you know, in Washington, D.C. I mean, you're like criticized if you talk to someone of the other party. That's insane. And I've not met very few legislators who like that or really believe it. And I think it starts by reaching out. I just spoke last night there's a young man that's running for the legislature I'm supporting, and the Speaker of the House was there, and we had exactly this conversation. That, you know, at some point we have to have the courage to test that theory, because I think it is a perception. I don't think there's anyone in Oregon, or very few people in Oregon, that like where we're at in terms of this angry battering of one another. I don't think we like it. We just don't know how to get out of it. And I think it starts with having someone who has the courage to reach out and say, look, wait a minute. There's not a Republican solution to this, or a Democratic solution. There's just a solution that recognizes we're all in this together, and we'll all be better if we find a way forward. And I don't think we argue about outcome ends. We argue about means to ends, right? So I think if you have a legislator who steps up and does that, they need to be supported. They need a letter. They need a phone call. And I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy aided by the internet. And I think we're the only ones that can break that. And we've done it in the past. And, you know, I think we can do it again. I think we need to.
What do you think of open primaries?
Yeah, I'm a big supporter of open primaries. I've always been a supporter of open primaries. I mean, the only people that benefit from the close primary are two parties. And when, the purpose of partisan politics becomes the acquisition and the retention of partisan power rather than using that to advance the larger public interest, it makes no sense. I am no longer a Democrat. And as Doc Holliday infamously said in Tombstone, Wyatt, my hypocrisy only goes so far. I have a problem with a party that basically says we're not going to let 30% of Oregonians participate in the process. The franchise of voting in this country has always been to expand the franchise from suffrage to direct election of U.S. senators to kids who are 18, and to say that a third of Oregonians aren't going to get to decide who is on the ballot in November. It's really repugnant to me. And I also support ranked choice voting. I think that also an open primary with ranked choice voting lets you think about who, to rank the candidates. They have it in Washington, California. They didn't sail off the edge of the earth. Well, maybe California's heading that way, but we need to do it.
Governor Kitzhaber, I have a question about the forestry housing. How do we get the resources like funding, roads, electricity, water supply into the forest? It's quite a far away from the city. The restaurants and schools and all that. It's quite a development we have to make.
So I'm sorry, I had trouble. Could you repeat the question, or someone repeat the question?
How do we get the resources if we develop the housing in the forest, like you mentioned earlier, like a water resources, electricity, gas, restaurants, as well as the public housing and schools?
So in terms of remote areas, if I understand the question, there's only one or two companies in Oregon that actually are doing mass timber. And mass timber is basically taking low value wood and making, mass plywood or cross laminated timber. It's an engineered product. The Ferris brothers up in the Santiam Canyon has a mass wood factory. If you're going to do this, you need to site let's say you're going to use that mass wood in modular housing, so you could produce a lot of modular housing. They need to be sited near the mass timber facilities, so you don't have to transport them twice, right? Because transportation obviously is an increasing cost because of the price of fuel. So what I would envision if we actually do this is you have a network not only of expanded mill capacity in certain parts of the state, which is necessary to do the forest health treatments to make the forest healthier, but you also have the mass wood facilities there as well. And I also think we need to just fundamentally rethink how we finance public housing. If any of you are developers and you've tried to develop a low income housing unit, I mean, it takes years. The average, and they end up costing $350,000 or $400,000 a unit. A whole lot of the money goes to compliance and reporting. So it's one of those moments where I think we need to step back and say, what is the outcome we want? And how do we have to change, let's say, the regulatory structure, the permitting process, maybe zoning issues to actually get that outcome? We let ourselves be constrained by the world as it is. And I think the world as it is a big part of the problem. Yeah, the question has to do with the proposed governance changes that I think are on the ballot here for Portland, for the Newport Rose Nation. I first let me say that I'm not an expert on the details of this. I mean, I've watched it develop. It's really complicated. I do think the governance structure in Portland is not a good governance structure. I think it would make much more sense to have a professional city manager. I think the sort of the dispersal of power is very hard to get things done, and there's not a lot of direct accountability, which is not necessarily the fault of the people who are in office, but they're in a structure that's very broken. Having said that, my only concern about this ballot measure is it seems like it's trying to do a whole lot of things at the same time, and it's kind of hard for me to parse out the impact. I mean, you can theoretically do things that sort of mutually undermine each other. So I think the complexity of it is a real problem. I have not decided how I'm going to vote on it yet. But that's my concern. I think we need to change the governance structure. Whether this is the best way to do it is I guess I'm not clear yet. Thank you.